Captain Mitchell convened an emergency meeting in the officers' mess, her voice sharp and steady despite the unease simmering in the room. "This ship is falling apart," she began, her gaze sweeping over the senior staff. "And I'm not just talking about the rust. We've lost Morales and the lower decks are becoming uninhabitable. I need solutions. Now." Hanlon leaned forward, his hands clenched on the table. "Captain, this isn't just corrosion. The rust is behaving like a living organism. It's consuming the ship, spreading through the metal like a virus. We need to abandon this mission and get to port before it overtakes us." "And what do we tell command?" Lieutenant Commander Aaron Blake, the XO, countered. "That our ship is being eaten by... what? Magic rust?" Hanlon's jaw tightened. "Call it what you want, but you've seen the walls. You've heard the noises. This thing is alive, and it's dangerous." Before Blake could reply, the lights flickered, casting long shadows across the room. A low groan reverberated through the ship, followed by a distant, metallic scraping sound that set everyone's teeth on edge. "It's getting worse," Hanlon said grimly. The next incident. The captain ordered a full evacuation of the lower decks. Anything essential was relocated to the upper levels, leaving the rusted halls eerily quiet and abandoned. But even above, the rust's advance was undeniable. It crept along pipes and bulkheads, spreading like blood through the ship's veins. Then, late one night, Petty Officer Linda Grayson screamed. She had been on duty in the communications room, trying to repair the static-filled radios. When the other sailors arrived, they found her curled in a corner, her eyes wide with terror. It came out of the wall," she stammered. "It reached for me." "What reached for you?" Captain Mitchell demanded, but Grayson could only point to the rusted console. The surface was warped and pitted, as though something had pressed against it from the inside. Faint, claw-like gouges marred the edges. Hanlon inspected the console, his face pale. "The rust. It's adapting. It's reaching beyond the metal now." The thing in the rust. The sightings grew more frequent. Sailors reported glimpses of movement in the shadows, twisting shapes that seemed to melt into the walls. Objects went missing, only to be found days later, covered in rust and warped beyond recognition. The ship's groans grew louder, almost like a voice straining to be heard. Then, one night, the ship's power failed. The USS Monarch plunged into darkness, the only light coming from emergency lanterns casting flickering, uneven glows. The crew gathered on the main deck, huddled together as the ship creaked and groaned around them. The rust seemed to thrive in the darkness, spreading faster, the pulsing glow within it more pronounced. From the engine room came a sound no one could explain, a deep, resonant growl that seemed to vibrate through the ship. "Something's in there," whispered Kelsey Tran, clutching a wrench like a weapon. "Something alive." Captain Mitchell made the call. "We're not waiting to find out what it is. All non-essential personnel to the lifeboats. We're abandoning ship." The descent. As the crew scrambled to lower the lifeboats, the rust fought back. Sections of the deck buckled and collapsed, the corroded metal snapping like brittle bones. Tendrils of rusted material shot upward, lashing out at the fleeing sailors. Hanlon stayed behind with a small team to rig the engine room with explosives, hoping to destroy the source of the rust. The air inside was thick and choking, the walls pulsating with an unnatural rhythm. Shapes writhed within the rust, their forms indistinct but undeniably alive. "It's like the ship's being consumed from another dimension," Hanlon muttered as he planted the charges. Before they could finish, one of the engineers, Alvarez, screamed. A massive, rust-covered appendage burst from the wall, snatching him up and pulling him into the pulsating mass. His screams echoed through the room before cutting off abruptly. "Go!" Hanlon shouted, shoving the others toward the exit. The end of the Monarch. The remaining crew watched from the lifeboats as the USS Monarch groaned one final time. The ship's silhouette against the night sky was grotesque, its once proud form now warped and writhing with rust and shadows. Hanlon triggered the explosives. The engine room erupted in a brilliant flash of fire and metal. For a moment, it seemed the plan had worked, but as the flames subsided, the rust remained. It pulsed faintly, spreading outward even as the ship began to sink beneath the waves. The last thing the crew saw before the Monarch vanished was a massive, rust-covered shape rising from the wreckage, its glowing eyes watching them as it sank into the depths. Aftermath. The Navy classified the incident, attributing the loss of the USS Monarch to a catastrophic structural failure. Survivors were debriefed, their accounts dismissed as trauma-induced hallucinations. But Hanlon knew the truth. Whatever had consumed the Monarch wasn't finished. He could feel it in the air, in the faint metallic taste that never left his mouth, and in the strange, rust-colored patches that had begun appearing on his skin. The USS Monarch was a proud vessel, a destroyer once hailed as the pinnacle of American naval engineering. But by the time it departed Norfolk for its final mission, its glory days were long behind it. The ship creaked with age, its once pristine hull scarred by years of salt and sea. And then there was the rust. It started in the engine room, a thin red-brown line that snaked along the walls and machinery. Chief Engineer Mike Hanlon noticed it during a routine inspection, but he wasn't alarmed. Ships rusted. It was a fact of life at sea. "Nothing a little elbow grease won't fix," he muttered to himself, running a hand over the corroded surface. The rust flaked off, leaving a powdery residue on his gloves. But the rust didn't stop. Within days, it had spread to other parts of the ship. The walls of the lower decks seemed to bleed rust, the metal corroding faster than anyone had ever seen. Pipes burst, staining the floors with water that carried an unnatural, oily sheen. The air grew heavy with a metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat. "It's not just rust," Hanlon told Captain Sarah Mitchell during a meeting in the ship's wardroom. He held up a sample of the corroded metal, now brittle and pitted. "It's something else. It's alive." Captain Mitchell frowned. "Alive? What are you saying, Chief?" "I'm saying this isn't natural. Look at this." Hanlon pulled out a magnifying glass and held it over the sample. Underneath the lens, the surface seemed to writhe, microscopic tendrils spreading like veins through the metal. The crew noticed the changes, too. Doors that had been sturdy and secure now groaned under their weight, the hinges corroded to the point of collapse. Bulkheads that had stood firm against storms for decades now crumbled at the slightest touch. And then came the sounds. At first, it was faint, a soft creaking that could be dismissed as the ship settling. But soon, the noises grew louder. Metallic groans echoed through the halls, accompanied by the sound of dripping water. At night, sailors reported hearing whispers, faint and unintelligible, coming from the darkest corners of the ship. Petty Officer Chris Morales was the first to disappear. He had been assigned to a night watch on the lower decks, tasked with keeping an eye on the flooding that had begun to seep into the bilge. When morning came, Morales was nowhere to be found. His bunk was untouched, and his belongings remained where he had left them. Search parties scoured the ship, but there was no trace of him. The only clue was his flashlight, found lying in a pool of rust-stained water. Its lens was cracked, and the handle was covered in deep scratches, as though it had been clawed by something. By the end of the week, the rust had overtaken nearly half the ship. The walls of the lower decks were now covered in a thick, red-brown crust that pulsed faintly, as if it had a heartbeat. The crew's unease turned to outright fear when one of the engineers, a young woman named Kelsey Tran, claimed to have seen something moving within the rust. "It was in the engine room," she whispered to Hanlon, her face pale. "I saw it crawling. Something big. It moved through the pipes like it was part of the ship." Hanlon didn't want to believe her, but the evidence was mounting. The rust was no longer just an infestation. It was a transformation. The ship itself was changing, becoming something new, something alive. Captain Mitchell ordered the crew to abandon the lower decks. Sealed doors were welded shut, cutting off access to the areas most affected by the rust. But even that wasn't enough. The rust continued to spread, seeping through cracks and seams, consuming everything in its path. The ship groaned under its weight, the sound like a dying animal. Sailors began reporting strange dreams, visions of the sea, dark and endless, and a massive, rotting entity rising from the depths to claim them. Morale plummeted. Sailors avoided the lower decks entirely, refusing to even walk near the sealed doors. Rumors spread like wildfire, each more outlandish than the last. "It's a curse," one sailor muttered to Hanlon in the mess hall. "The ship's been out here too long. The ocean's claiming it." Another chimed in, his voice low. "I heard Morales isn't dead. He's still down there, part of it now." Hanlon slammed his hand on the table, silencing them. "Enough! We're going to fix this." But deep down, he wasn't sure if it was even possible. It was a stormy night when the rust breached the upper decks. Lightning illuminated the ship as sheets of rain pounded against the hull. In the chaos, one of the sealed doors burst open, releasing a wave of red-tinged water that spilled into the corridor. Ensign Daniel Reed was the first to see it. As he approached the breach, flashlight in hand, he froze. Something was crawling out of the darkness, something massive and covered in rust. It was vaguely humanoid, its form twisting and writhing as though it were made of liquid metal. Its skin was a patchwork of corroded steel, and its eyes glowed faintly, like embers. Reed screamed, dropping his flashlight as the creature lunged at him. The last thing he felt was its cold, metallic grip pulling him into the shadows. The ship was plunged into chaos. The storm raged outside, but the greater terror was within. The creature, if it could be called that, moved through the ship like a predator, its rust-covered body blending seamlessly with the corroded walls. Captain Mitchell barked orders through the intercom. "All hands to the upper deck! Stay in groups, and do not engage!" Sailors scrambled, their footsteps echoing through the labyrinthine corridors. The air was thick with fear and the acrid stench of decay. The rust pulsed along the walls, growing tendrils that writhed like living things. Hanlon and his team were in the engine room, their last sanctuary rapidly deteriorating. The machinery groaned and sputtered, the rust choking every vital component. "We can't hold out much longer," Kelsey Tran said, her voice trembling as she checked a gauge. "Everything's failing." Hanlon gritted his teeth. "We're not leaving this ship without a fight." The engines were primed. The overload sequence initiated. The ship began to shudder violently, warning lights flashing as a countdown began on the main console. "Get to the lifeboats!" Hanlon shouted, shoving Tran and the others toward the exit. "What about you?" Tran cried. "I'll make sure it doesn't stop this." Hanlon grabbed a heavy pipe and turned to face the creature, which was already advancing again, its form blackened but undeterred. The USS Monarch detonated, a fireball ripping through its rusted hull. The shockwave rocked the lifeboats, throwing sailors into the churning sea. Pieces of the ship rained down, sizzling as they hit the water. When the smoke cleared, the Monarch was gone. Only a twisted mass of rust and debris remained, sinking slowly beneath the waves. Weeks later, the Navy declared the USS Monarch lost at sea, its fate attributed to a catastrophic structural failure during the storm. Survivors were debriefed and silenced under threat of court-martial. Officially, the incident never happened, but those who lived knew the truth. Tran kept a journal, documenting everything. In her final entry, she wrote, "The Monarch is gone, but I still hear it. In my dreams, I see the rust spreading, feel the hunger. It's not over. Whatever was on that ship, it's still out there." Miles below the ocean's surface, where sunlight could never reach, Something stirred within the wreckage. The rust pulsed faintly, waiting, and hungrier than ever. The rust consumes. By dawn, the ship was in chaos. The creature, or creatures, were everywhere, emerging from the rust to stalk the remaining crew. The sailors fought back with whatever weapons they had, but bullets and blades were useless against something that wasn't entirely solid. "We have to scuttle the ship," Hanlon said, his voice grim as he met with Captain Mitchell on the bridge. "There's no saving it. Whatever this is, it's going to take all of us if we don't sink it." Mitchell hesitated, her jaw tight. "And what happens if this thing spreads? If it survives the sinking?" Hanlon didn't have an answer. The plan was simple. Overload the ship's engines, triggering an explosion that would send the Monarch to the bottom of the ocean. But as the remaining crew worked to rig the charges, the rust began to close in. The walls themselves seemed to come alive, the metallic tendrils reaching out to ensnare them. One by one, the sailors fell, dragged into the rust by the creatures. Hanlon and Mitchell were the last, barricading themselves in the engine room as the ship groaned and shuddered around them. "Do it," Mitchell said, handing Hanlon the detonator. He nodded, his hand trembling as he pressed the button. From the safety of a nearby rescue ship, the survivors watched as the Monarch was consumed by flames, its rust-covered hull collapsing in on itself before sinking into the depths. But as the last of the wreckage disappeared beneath the waves, Hanlon swore he saw something. A faint, glowing light pulsing deep beneath the surface, as if the rust, and whatever it had become, wasn't finished. And in the silence that followed, he thought he heard a whisper. It wasn't over.